Think about the moment an organization decides to bring AI into its operations. Maybe it's automating a hiring process, approving loans, or flagging security risks. The technology is ready. But is the organization ready to use it responsibly? That's exactly the question that responsible AI principles are designed to answer.
And when we say responsible AI, we're not talking about a vague ideal. We're talking about 5 concrete commitments: fairness, transparency, accountability, privacy, and safety, that together form the ethical foundation underneath every AI decision an organization makes.
A good way to picture it is like the structural framework of a building. You don't see it, but everything else depends on it. If it's weak, the whole structure is at risk. These principles work the same way. They're not decorations, they're load-bearing walls.
And that distinction matters because there's a real difference between compliance and genuine ethical intent. Compliance says, we followed the rules. Responsible AI says, we did the right thing. One is a minimum bar. The other is a commitment.
What's also important to understand is that trust is incredibly fragile in this space. A single biased decision made public, one unexplainable outcome affecting someone's livelihood, that's enough to unravel months of careful work. Trust is earned slowly and lost quickly.
Which is why these principles can't live only in a policy document. They need to be wired into systems, procurement processes, workflows, and governance structures. If they're not actively embedded, they offer no real protection to anyone.
And the consequences of ignoring them aren't just organizational. AI operating without ethical guardrails can affect hiring decisions, financial access, public services harm that ripples far beyond any single institution.
So the natural next step is to move from the framework itself into each principle individually. And there's one that consistently sparks the most debate when organizations actually try to apply it in the real world.
That's the question we'll explore next. What does it actually mean to build an AI system that treats everyone fairly? Think about the last time a decision was made about you: a job application, a loan, an opportunity. Now imagine that decision wasn't made by a person, but by an algorithm. And that algorithm had quietly absorbed decades of human bias before it ever saw your name. That's not a hypothetical. That's the reality organizations face when they deploy AI without deliberately addressing fairness.
And what makes this particularly challenging is that the bias isn't always visible. The system doesn't announce its prejudice, it simply produces outcomes that consistently favor one group over another, often at a scale and speed no human decision maker could match.
Exactly. And in a region like the GCC, where organizations serve genuinely diverse workforces and populations, this becomes a governance responsibility, not just a technical problem. A hiring tool trained on historical data, where one gender was consistently preferred, doesn't just repeat that pattern, it institutionalizes it. Quietly, efficiently, at scale.
So how do organizations push back against that?
By making fairness measurable. Not assumed, not hoped for, actually measured. Tools that scan for disparities in data and outputs, metrics that track whether different groups are receiving equal consideration, and regular audits that treat fairness as an ongoing discipline rather than a box ticked at launch. That evidence base is what allows organizations to defend their decisions and demonstrate genuine accountability.
So fairness becomes something you can document and prove, not just claim.
Precisely. And that shift from assumption to evidence changes how organizations procure, build, and govern their AI systems entirely. But once an organization can demonstrate that its AI is fair, a deeper question emerges. Even if the outcome is fair, can the people affected by that decision actually understand how it was reached? And what happens to trust when they cannot? There is a moment that many organizations eventually face: a customer calls frustrated, asking why a decision was made about them. Maybe a loan was declined, an insurance claim rejected, or a job application filtered out. And the person on the other end of that call has no answer. Not because they are hiding something, but because genuinely no one knows. The AI made the decision and no one thought to ask how.
That is actually more common than people realize. And the troubling part is that the system may have been working exactly as designed. The problem is that no one built in the ability to explain it.
Exactly. And this is where two closely related ideas become essential. The first is transparency, the organizational commitment to being open about how an AI system works, what it was trained on, and what its limitations are. It is less about publishing technical documents and more about signaling to the people you serve that you have nothing to hide. The second is explainability, which is more personal. It means that when an AI decision affects someone directly, that person deserves a real, meaningful answer. Not the system decided, A real answer.
And when neither of those things exist, what happens?
A governance vacuum. When decisions cannot be explained, they cannot be challenged. And when they cannot be challenged, errors, bias, and misuse quietly accumulate. No one is watching because no one can see inside.
So transparency and explainability are essentially what make oversight possible in the first place.
Precisely. And in regions like the GCC, where AI regulation is maturing quickly, this is shifting from good practice to legal expectation faster than many organizations are prepared for.
Which makes you wonder, even when an organization commits to transparency, who is actually responsible when something goes wrong?
That is exactly the right question. Because principles without ownership tend to stay on paper. And what turns a commitment into an enforceable responsibility is something we will explore next. Think about any major decision an organization makes: approving a loan, flagging a medical risk, selecting a candidate for a role. Now imagine that decision was made, at least in part, by an AI system. And when something goes wrong, everyone looks around the room and no one raises their hand. That absence of ownership is exactly what accountability in AI is designed to prevent.
So it is not about blaming the technology itself, because a system cannot be held responsible. It is about making sure there is always a person or a team who genuinely owns what that system produces.
Precisely. And ownership alone is not enough. Organizations need clear structures to who approves an AI deployment, who watches over it once it is running, and who has the authority to intervene or shut it down entirely. Alongside that, there need to be detailed records, logs of what the system decided, when, and based on what. So that if something goes wrong, you are not guessing. You can trace it.
And I imagine the risk of skipping all of this is that problems quietly accumulate until something serious forces the question.
That is exactly what history has shown us. When no one owns the consequences, errors get minimized or deflected. Accountability creates the institutional pressure to actually act. It makes the risk real, not theoretical. And it has to exist across the entire life cycle, from the earliest design choices all the way through to daily monitoring.
Which means accountability cannot be an afterthought. It needs to be mapped out before the system ever goes live.
Exactly. Named roles, escalation paths, review mechanisms, all defined in advance. And this actually brings us to something that works hand in hand with accountability. Because while we have been talking about who is responsible for AI decisions, there is an equally important question about the people those decisions affect: their privacy, their dignity, and whether the system was ever truly built with them in mind. Think about the last time you used a service that felt like it truly understood you, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt respectful. That feeling doesn't happen by accident. It happens when the people who built that system made a deliberate choice to put you, the human, at the center of every decision they made.
And that's essentially what we're talking about when we say privacy and human-centered design have to be built in from the start, not added later as an afterthought.
Exactly. Imagine a hospital deploying an AI diagnostic tool. The system can analyze thousands of patient records and surface patterns no single doctor could catch alone. But here's what matters: who makes the final call? In a well-designed system, the clinician does. The AI informs the judgment. It doesn't replace it. That's human-centered design in practice.
And on the privacy side, it's not just about following regulations. It's about earning trust. People need to know their data is being collected only when necessary, only with their knowledge, and only for a purpose they've agreed to.
Which is a meaningful shift for many organizations. The old default was collect everything, figure out the use later. Responsible AI flips that entirely. And when these principles are violated, when people feel surveilled or manipulated or excluded from decisions that affect them, the damage to trust is not easily undone.
So these aren't ideals to work toward eventually. They're the minimum standard, the foundation everything else has to be built on.
And that word foundation leads us naturally to what that foundation is actually made of. Because before any governance structure can work, before any AI system can be called responsible, there's something even more fundamental we need to examine: Jess, the data itself and the ethical responsibilities that follow it from the very first moment it enters your organization.